Thank you for joining us. Thank you so much for being here, joining this event co-hosted by the Society of Design Arts, SODA, AIGA Baltimore, and Stevenson University. We're going to have tonight SHAN Wallace and Elena Volkova having a conversation about photography. We are very happy to have you all here taking time out of your day to join us. Please, we are curious to know where are you joining us from. So if you all have the chat option, the chat box, so please tell us where are you joining now. We already have 41 participants that joined. That's great. Hi everyone, welcome. So we have people from Baltimore. That's great. Hi. Where else? So we're, for the ones that are joining us now, we are happy to have you here in this event hosted by the Society of Design Arts, AIGA Baltimore, and Stevenson University. We are asking people to live in the chat box, tell us where you're joining from. So Ed is joining for Baltimore too. We have people from New Jersey, Towson, Baltimore again. Great, Atlanta. Amazing, yay. Awesome. So my name is Raquel Castedo. I'm a member of both the Society of Design Arts Planning Committee and the AIGA Baltimore's board as SODA's liaison. For those who don't know, AIGA is the Professional Association for Design. As the largest and oldest community of design advocates, we bring together practitioners, enthusiasts, and patrons to amplify the voice of design and create the vision for a collective future. Our 75 chapters are run 100% by volunteers, serving over 20,000 members across the nation. If you want to, if you want to get more information about and get to know us better, please join us on social media and visit our website, baltimore.aiga.org. In October, we're going to have Design Month, and it's coming soon. So watch your inbox and our website for more information. We have the pleasure to have with us tonight Richard Stanley, a member of the Society of Design Arts, who will talk about SODA's recent rebrand. Hello, Richard.
Hello, Raquel. Thank you very much. And welcome to our third online program, which we've been very excited to be able to bring to people internationally, which has been great fun. The Society for Design Arts was formed up by a group of people, all volunteers, about 15 years ago, and it was it was organized to explore the history of design in every different aspect we could think of. Primarily, it's been a lot to do with the print industry, since that's what was prevalent back at that time. But we've also looked at graphic design, industrial design, architecture, the book arts, and many other areas that were of interest to us from a historical standpoint. If you'd like to see kind of a broad cross-section of a lot of the things that we've done, check out sodabaltimore.com. Go to the gallery, the poster gallery section, and you can look through a collection of the posters that we've put together to promote each of the programs we put on. I think you'll find that quite interesting. The other thing would be to stay there on the website long enough to register your name so that we could put you on our mailing list. That's the best way to keep up with what's coming up in the future. As a matter of fact, in the future, we've got some great programming. We're still nailing down our speakers and the dates and times and so forth, but we will be participating in AIGA's October Design Month, as well as having programs into the later fall and perhaps more to come after the first of the year. So anyway, that's what we've got coming up. Thank you for joining us. And I'd like to turn it over to Lori Rubling, who is Professor of Design at Stevenson University, and will have some exciting news for us about our SODA Baltimore exhibit, which you see behind me at Stevenson University has been closed to the public for a while, but now we are looking forward to having at least a few ways of getting to see it. So Lori, take it away.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you Raquel, and it's a pleasure to be here tonight to be moderating our discussions with Elena and SHAN. So in order to see the Society for Design Arts or SOTA Classic exhibition, we'd like you all to, you can contact me or go to our SOTA Baltimore website, and we'll start posting days and times, which you can visit the exhibition space. It's in the Creative Lounge and the Kevin Manning Academic Center. And it only can really hold 6 to 8 people at a time, so we have to manage that. I also want to thank everyone at Stevenson for supporting SOTA's programming. So before we get started tonight, I want everyone to just lay down some rules. In the chat, you are invited to talk to each other, you know, share comments. And then if you have questions for our presenters, just place them in the Q&A chat channel, and they will be asked to our presenters at the end of the evening. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce my colleague, Elena Volkova, born in 1975. She is a Ukrainian-born interdisciplinary artist, photographer, and educator. Elena's creative work focuses on liminality and subjective experiences of the everyday. She has exhibited nationally and internationally. Elena has been co-host of a photojournalism podcast, 10 Frames Per Second, and has collaborated with the Maryland Center for History and Culture on the exhibition Reflections, a brief history of looking at ourselves. Recently, Elena has been creating portraits using the web plate collodion process. She lives in Baltimore with her family and teaches photography at Stevenson University. Welcome, Elena.
Thank you so much, Lori. I'd like to thank everybody for having me here. SOTA, AIGA, Baltimore. I'm going to talk a little bit about my exhibition that I curated titled Reflections. So I would really extend my thank yous to Maryland Center for History and Culture for collaborating on this exhibit, and Stevenson University for supporting this project with faculty research grant. I also would like to thank my co-curator, Joe Trapea, who works at Maryland Center for History and Culture, and thank you, SHAN, for being here and having, you know, sharing this talk with me, because I'm delighted to put your work in context in history of photography and what we're going to be talking about today. And thank you so much, Lori, for putting this together and for inviting me. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, thank you. It's taking me a second to move all the icons around. Okay, everybody. All right, so today's talk is going to be, I'm going to begin by an overview of the Reflections exhibition. And I'm starting with some photographs that are a part of the Historic Photography Archive at Maryland Center for History and Culture. And I'm going to share with you a little bit of our identity that we created for the exhibit. So this exhibit was organized in 2019 as we celebrated 180th birthday of photography. And it was important to me as a photographer to work on this project because I feel like history of photography is such a contested field right now. I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is, and maybe ask, you know, pose some questions to keep in the listeners' minds. So, and these questions are, when we look at the history of photography, what do we know? Who tells the stories through photographs? Who is overlooked and why? And I'm going to share a little bit of my experience of being a photography student at Maryland Institute College of Art. And I learned from a textbook that was written in the 70s, and there were probably 2 women photographers and no photographers of color or international photographers. And I feel like in 2000s, that should have been the time when we expand the conversation of whose history we're telling. And I want to just throw in a couple of examples of from that history. And I'm just going to share that I'm not perfect when it comes to understanding history of photography and researching it. So please take these images with a grain of salt, because I feel like in 10 years, I will be sharing the work of completely different set of photographers, just because I will have expanded what I know. So this is the first world-known selfie, first recorded selfie by Robert Cornelius of Philadelphia. On the back of this photographic plate, which is a daguerreotype, he wrote the first picture ever taken. And what's interesting about this first ever picture taken is that it is the first picture ever taken by Cornelius, right? So we tend to just take it as a face value and say, oh, is this the first picture ever taken? Or is this the first selfie? But what's interesting, of course, is that photographers use themselves as subject to test equipment and to test technology all the time. So I'm sure anybody who has ever engaged with photography in any way has taken this first picture ever taken ever. Another element that is important in context of talking about the exhibit and photographic portraiture is this idea of acting for the camera. And this is an example of French photographer Hippolyte Bayard. He created this self-portrait as a drowned man because he was actually tinkering with photography way before 1839. And his processes were not recognized, and he created this image as in, you know, to show the world how miserable he was. And he is famous for saying, what the eye sees and what the photograph records may not be trustworthy. We tend to think photography as a medium that communicates truth, but since the early time, this truth has been told from a very personal perspective and can be quite subjective and manipulated and manipulative. Another image that is important to me personally is this idea of relationship between the photographer, the subject, and the viewer. So Nadar created this portrait of Pierrot, the photographer, who's a fictional character. And he's photographed here with the camera as if he's taking a photograph of the viewer. And of course, he's taking the photograph of the photographer. So I think this photo is a really interesting example of this tri-fold relationship between the camera in the hands of photographer, pointed at the viewer, at the subject, and then reflected in how we understand this photograph from the viewer's perspective. And finally, Julia Margaret Cameron was one of the first celebrated women photographers, and she worked with her subject to kind of interrogate how a metaphor could be explored through a photograph of a person. And she created this really interesting body of work. She photographed a lot of her family, a lot of female subjects that are posed as fictional characters or characters from the Bible. She was kind of from the British elites. She was friends with Pre-Raphaelites, and she developed her aesthetic in kind of this like dreamy Pre-Raphaelite-like, elements. And because she was from the elites and she was friends with a lot of scientists of the time, her work became well known. And I just want to let this hang for a little bit, because we can think about all the women who had cameras and who practiced photography, whose work was not recognized because women at the time simply were not welcomed into the art world. Sojourner Truth, she was born into slavery, and she ran away multiple times. In 1826, she ran away and she dedicated her life into sharing her stories and changing public opinion of how we see Black people. So she she commissioned portraits of herself, and she distributed them as there were small carte de visites, which were kind of business card-like photographs. And at the bottom, you see, it says, "I sell the shadow to support the substance." So there were pocket-size images that were sold for pretty cheaply, so people could afford buying them, and they were very popular. She even worked through the copyright law as she imprinted her slogan. Because then the photograph was owned by her and not by the photographer. And that way she traveled and promoted her speaking tours. And of course, Frederick Douglass, he was the most photographed man of the 19th century. This image was taken in 1841. It's one of the earliest photographs of Douglass. Douglass was, there are over 150 photographs exist of Douglass, and here's some examples of these images. So Douglass was invited to give a lecture about his abolitionist ideas, and in 1861 he gave a lecture in Boston that was titled "Pictures in Progress," and he upset the audience quite a bit because he actually talked about photography. And as he in his speech, he attempted to create a positive and undistorted visual representation of Black people. And from his speech, he said, "A very pleasant feature of our pictorial relations is the very easy terms upon which all may enjoy them. The servant girl can now see a likeness of herself." This was before the photography was called photography. It was just called likeness, such as noble ladies and even royalty itself could not purchase 50 years ago, and so forth. All right, so these several images bring me to the idea that we had to put together the exhibition. These are a little excerpts from our brochure. All right, so this first image, when I discovered this image working with Maryland Historical Society's archives, it was really, really beautiful and interesting to me that this photo was taken in 1915. This was way before people were comfortable sharing their intimate spaces with each other. So this is called Teresa and Jim as Lovers, taken by James Lewis. It is assumed that this is a self-portrait, and it was really interesting because Jim, the male figure in the photo, is actually the photographer. And the reason their hands are cropped off is because he's actually probably most likely holding the cable release that is taking the photograph. Although he's like looking away from the camera, and Teresa is making eye contact with us, and she has this seductive look on her face. So there's so many different layers in how we can read this photograph. And in this particular image, I was interested in how this relationship between the photographer, the viewer, and the subject is really interestingly put together. So we kind of see, as viewers, observed by Teresa, and then we're looking at Jim, who's looking away. So there's this really interesting gaze relationship happening. So here is this image as an installation. Most of these photographs were printed digitally. A couple of key points from the exhibition. We started with questions, and instead of answering those questions, we wanted to have them remain as questions. So on the wall, as a wall text, you see the text says, "We express a sense of belonging when we take a group photograph." So this wall was about belonging, and most of these photographs are historical archives scanned and printed on plexiglass. There's a couple of images from Preserve Baltimore Uprising Archive, and those you see in color. So those are the most recent images that Maryland Center has archived. So the questions that we asked to viewers and wanted the viewers to consider as they view in the exhibit is, what do these groups group representations reveal about the subjects, which of these images invite you, the viewer, to belong, and do these photographs confirm or challenge our perception of an idyllic childhood? There's some interesting children photos in there. I have to say that this exhibit is still installed. However, because of the quarantine, nobody's allowed to see it. So as a part of this group photography, this is just an example. This is actually an accident scene. And when I found this image, I was very excited because this photograph started with just the scene of one of the tubes on the floor, on the ground, that fell and during some sort of an incident. So slowly, as these photographs progressed, people started piling up and posing for the picture. So this was the final image in the series. And this photo is just so perfectly posed and speaks to this mastery of photographer to create a group photograph. So next, while a photograph is evidence of relationship between the photographer, subject, and viewer. So the questions we wanted to ask is, what can we learn from the relationship between the subject and the viewer? And what power does the connection of gaze hold over time? I'm going to, the next slide is looking at this a photograph of Katerina Jarbara. She was a performer at Shuffle and Along Ensemble. And she's looking at the, we don't even know who took this photo, right? But this relationship of her making an eye contact with the viewer is pretty incredible. And I just want to point out on the right hand side, we had a monitor that created a feed of photos that people posted on Instagram and tagged Reflections MDHS. So we had like a contemporary element in the form of a rotating slide. And lastly, a photograph is an opportunity to perform. What kind of role playing is evident in these images? How does photography shape our identity as communicated in the images we share? And I have two examples from that. I'm not going to talk in depth about it. One photo that is talked a lot about is titled "The White Masks Inspecting a Prisoner at Detective Headquarters." If you would like to learn about this image a little more in depth, you can simply type this in search. MDHS has a blog post about this photo, and also there's an interview on Midday that Joe and I did back in the summer, last summer, where we talk about this photograph. But it's great because we can all wonder what is going on here, right? Another slide is performance of these artists going on this excursion. So there's a whole series of images in the archive of these artists who just went and traveled on the train. So this one is posed on the Cowcatcher, group on Cowcatcher of Train, 1858. And here's a few more exhibition views. We featured Baltimore photographer John Dubas, who was an immigrant and started taking photos when he was a teenager. And he was a really interesting character, as shown in these photos, a lot of self-portraits. Emily Spencer Hayden, she was one of the interesting photographers in Baltimore whose work is just absolutely beautiful. And of course, she was a teacher and she just took photos and painted for her leisure. On the right-hand side is another exhibition view of the case where we displayed like actual cased photographs. Here's another one. Another exhibition view. I'm hoping that you all will have questions and I will have a chance to go back and talk about this a little more in depth. And here's some our lovely Stevenson students on the field trip. And on the picture on the right is my student Destiny, who created this photo, and her photo was rotating in the slideshow. And here's Destiny, the photographer, with her picture in space. All right, so this is, I'm going to transition to my work doing tintype portraits. So here, this is another exhibition view where we created a history photography timeline. And at the bottom, you see a little chair with head clamp, which we had in the show as an artifact of how subjects had to suffer when their portraits were taken 180 years ago. So this is just a screenshot from my Instagram. This was from back like last year. So I have more images there and hopefully more followers. So if you're curious, my Instagram is thinstring, and I have this portfolio on my website. It's called Tintype Portraits. You're welcome to check it out. Okay, so we wanted to do more. And as I was curating this exhibit, I started practicing tintype wet plate collodion process. I took a workshop and I fell in love with it. And slowly I started providing portrait sessions in collaboration with Maryland, I keep saying Historical Society, but it's Maryland Center for History and Culture. And we started put together, so some of the portrait sessions we started with were at Maryland Historical Society. And we thought what a great opportunity to invite people of all walks of life to come in and get their portrait taken. However, we found that we have to go into the community and go to where people are to create an archive that represents more the social landscape of Baltimore. So we contacted OpenWorks and Greenmount West Community Center and Jubilee Center and started organizing these portrait sessions. So this is an example that we did at Greenmount West Community Center. And I come with my portable darkroom, with my camera, with all my chemicals. We set up a backdrop and we invite people to come in and pose for a portrait. There's another one. So I'm going kind of backwards. Of course, we had to stop. The last one we did, it was in February because everything got put on hold. And this process is just so folks understand, we start with a plate that's hand-coated in silver and has to be exposed to light in camera within 2 minutes of it being coated. So here are some photographs from old OpenWorks. And for me as a photographer, I never thought of myself as a portrait photographer, but this exhibit really inspired me to pay attention to how people pose for portraits and the body language. So I try to do a little intervention in how people like to represent themselves. However, I encourage people to think about what they're gonna look like for the photograph. And my favorite is when this kind of like moment that's similar to falling in love is created during a portrait session, when the person knows exactly what they're doing, right, where they're looking at, and the self-confidence, and then the lighting and the chemicals work. And it's just for me it's a matter of pressing the shutter release just right at the right moment. And it's very intuitive. I don't know how to describe that even. So here you see a couple who brought a bunny to take a holiday tintype portrait. At OpenWorks, we did portraits of makers. So here's a couple of examples of that. And here are some examples from the portrait session at Maryland Center for History and Culture. And some of you from Stevenson may know this woman. Lori, I think she was a student back. I'm gonna go back. You probably have seen her before. And it was really interesting. We had a lot of fun. I learned that children need to book like 3 times as long time because they just refuse to cooperate. You all know this person, or these two. And last few images are of people who worked at Maryland Historical Society. We did a test session. So these are like my first tintypes. And I'm gonna end with this image because I want to maybe in a way segue into SHAN's talk, but also just share with you that I get so much feedback about this image. When people see it on my website, they're like, how did this happen? What is going on? How did these three people came together for a portrait? Because it looks so old and historic. And I just want to say that because history of photography did not or failed to record fully the diversity of people at the time, and this is just because we think that most photographs that exist in the archives are the photographs of either white people or people who could afford photography. However, there is an extended archive that that is just not a part of our history that is widely examined of African Americans in America and throughout the world. So just because we don't know something, we have to remember that there's a reason why, and these stories have been excluded from the conversation of who is represented. And I'm going to end my portion on this note, and I hope I can answer some of your questions.
Thank you, Elena. It's wonderful.
Yeah,
and a great segue into SHAN's work. So everyone, our next presenter is SHAN Wallace, born in 1991. She's a nomadic, award-winning visual artist, photographer, educator, and freedom fighter from East Baltimore, Maryland. Inspired by the harsh racial, social, and economic realities of her surroundings in Baltimore, SHAN learned about the importance of service, the power of collaboration, and the effects of social change at an early age. Now she uses her lens, collage, and in situ installations as the basis of her work, demonstrating the cultural and political narratives of Black life, confronting oppressive politics and histories within communities of the African diaspora, and challenging ideas surrounding existing collections, cultures, and archives of Blackness. Much of SHAN Wallace's work is focused on the archive, its history of development, challenges, which also challenges the modern archive, and thinks about archive as artwork and how to ethically accumulate primary source documents. So welcome, SHAN, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you all for having me, Elena. I really enjoyed your presentation and the photographs that you shown that you did at OpenWorks. So thank you for sharing. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. So I'm just going to briefly talk about what I do here in Baltimore and what I do throughout the country. So a little bit about me to piggyback on what Lori said. Award-winning photographer. I'm going to talk about that. Visual artist, educator, freedom fighter from East Baltimore. Photography opens the door for me to teach. So I taught here for Baltimore Viewfinders. I had a teaching fellowship at the Getty that I just finished up. So I kind of teach wherever there's an offer for me. I received a lot of support from the Washington Post, Baltimore Sun, the Charlotte Observer, New York Times, the Daily Beast, and more. As a photographer, well, as an artist, I've been nomadic, which basically means that my home base is in Baltimore, but I travel and live in different states and different counties and countries making art. So I want to start off with some career highlights. So some career highlights. In 2016, I got voted best photographer, which was pretty cool. It was by the city paper. I wasn't expecting it at all because I've been a photographer for about a decade, but I started to really pursue art and to pursue documentary photography around 2015. And so to get the award was pretty cool because I didn't think that anyone was really watching. And so it certainly helped my confidence. It certainly helped me feel like I was making the right decision by pursuing my dreams. Because before I believe that same year I was working at Best Buy for corporate and I was laid off. And so from there I said, okay, well, I'm just gonna follow my dreams and see what happens there. Then the next year, 2017, I did a solo show called Ain't I a Woman? That is, it's a reflection and a homage to Sojourner Truth, who Elena talked about earlier. She did a speech called Ain't I a Woman? And that speech, but also the book by Bell Hooks, and just many words of wisdom and experiences that women, Black women especially, have discussed, influenced me for the show. And so I got voted best solo show for the Baltimore Beat, which was really great. Then that year I got front page of the Washington Post. So once we got Governor Hogan, the bus system here changed dramatically. The prices went up, the amount of bus routes decreased. The bus system really changed in a way that wasn't beneficial to most people, most riders. And so as a rider, as a bus rider, I just started to document that transition and I started to document that change. And the Washington Post read an article that I was interviewed for and asked, could they come to Baltimore and follow me and talk about the bus system? So I'm going to show you that too. I got second place for excellence in healthcare journalism. I photographed a family that was raising a child who had childhood dementia. And so it was the first time I was sent on a kind of a short-term assignment. It was a couple of weeks where I just photographed this family's life as they were raising. They have this beautiful story of this mother realizing that her child had some sort of disability, and she tirelessly tried to figure out what was going on. And it was tough for her, but the family eventually figured it out, got some support, went to the White House. And so I got an award for my photographs in that. And then the Annenberg Space for Photography in Los Angeles sent me to Detroit to make some work about the Detroit Wall, which is a wall that was built in 1941 in 8 Mile, which is the top of Detroit. Not the 8 Mile where Eminem's from, but 8 Mile. They sent me there to do some work around this wall that was built in 1941 to separate white families and Black families. That wall still exists. That wall is still there. It has a different existence now, but that wall is still in existence. And then my last career highlight is I have a solo show at the Baltimore Museum of Art, which I encourage you all to go see. The entire contemporary wing is of female identifying artists. Me, Valerie Maynard, who is about in her 80s, maybe 90s. She was the first artist at the Studio Museum in Harlem, and Alyssa Moorhead in collaboration with Bradford Young. They both are filmmakers here living in the city. So this here is just the front page of the Washington Post. That was me when I had long hair, but these are just snapshots that I took on our bus ride. So the article was basically about what does the bus system says about race, class, poverty, and us. And so it was an honor to have Washington Post come up and interview me and also interview other people about the bus system, because the bus system really changed our lives. And the bus system is not as good as it used to be. And so as an artist and photographer, community is what I value the most. I believe in being in service. I believe in collaboration. And so I can't make the work that I make without community. And so this story here was basically a way for me to show up for my community, but also show up for myself, because I am a bus rider. And, as a photographer, I really believe in being immersed in the community as much as I can, being a part of my neighborhood. So I intentionally don't drive. I intentionally catch the bus. I intentionally do things that connects me closer to the people in which I want to collaborate with and photograph. And this here is just a screenshot of the webpage from the city paper saying that I got best photographer. And so I'm just going to show you just some photographs of mine from that series that the Washington Post the bus series basically. It was called What We Learned While Waiting. And so the journalist came up and we took a bus ride. We started from North Avenue in Maryland. We took the 13, which is now the Gold, all the way up to Walbrook Junction. And then we got off and we went across the street to North Avenue in Elamont and took the bus back down. And so these are just some photographs that I took on that ride. And we stopped at a couple places. This is actually Monument and North Avenue. This is Greenmount and North Avenue. And so this project started really because, you know, the bus benches say Baltimore, the greatest city in America. It used to say Baltimore, a city that reads. I went to public school here. I graduated from public school here. And we really have some issues with literacy here. We have some issues with just education in general. When I was in the 6th grade, No Child Left Behind Act was enforced immediately. And so I graduated with a lot of folks who were not on the correct reading level. And I'm sure myself, I was included in that too, because the public schools here really just failed us. And that bill especially failed us. And so if I'm going to be talking about the bus transformation, I have to be talking about the infrastructures, which is the bus benches and the bus shelters, how some bus stops have bus shelters and bus stops and bus benches, and some bus stops just don't have anything, where you just have to stand and maybe sit on someone's steps if you're tired. And, you know, the bus benches, they serve purpose. They serve purpose for people to sleep on, for people to sit on. It's a place of community. It's a place of communion. It's a place where you get to talk to your stranger. You get to talk to your neighbor, possibly. And so the project started to graduate from, okay, if I'm talking about the bus benches, I need to be talking about the people who catch the bus. If I'm talking about the people who catch the bus, I need to be talking about the circumstance in which these people live in. And so this was in South Baltimore. And this is where we started. This is North Avenue and Maryland. And so I want you to take note of these images in these women's hands that I'm going to talk about a little more. And so as a photographer, I love photographing people especially, but there are just small details of the city that I can't ignore. And so here I remember walking by this bus bench and seeing the greatest city in America, but having cities scratched out and put in dope. And, you know, my parents were addicted to drugs. My parents struggled with drugs. Our city is a city where people struggle with all sorts of vices. And so this is a detail that, you know, was very personal to me, but one that I just really couldn't ignore. And I think is also a reflection of, you know, our city. And, you know, I go inside of hair salons and I photograph women in hair salons. I'm a photographer that I try to make work everywhere. So just not on the streets, but also in places where we convene, places where we receive services. And then here is one of my favorite images. This is an Oliver community, so like Rutland and like Washington, I believe. And you know, I care about my city. I care about the people here. As a photographer, my goal is to always, you know, make work that's critical, make work that people are proud of, but also to assert us into museum spaces. Because like Elena talked about, archives that institutions have ownership over have rarely included Black people, Black Americans especially. And so my goal is to always include us in the work that I do, to center us, to talk about our lives, and to make really good images that we can value and keep. And this was a year after Freddie Gray here. It's one of my favorite images. This was the image that I took and I was like, oh, I might be a good photographer. This was a moment that I know that I won't be able to probably get again. But a little bit of context. This is in Sandtown, right where Freddie Gray's from. And I think it was Calhoun and Curry Street. and the police officer stopped. I have a series, but the police officer stopped at the stop sign, and there were a couple of protesters behind me, and I was in front, and these young boys just raised their fists. And I took the image, and at the time, I just got a new camera too, so I didn't really know how to work it, and I got the photograph, and I was like, okay, Shan, you might be onto something. You actually might be good at this. Keep going at it. It's one of my most popular images here. It's in the same community of this one. This is actually his family. This is his mother, and these are his two sisters and his brother. And so a part of my process is returning to neighborhoods, returning to certain streets, because, you know, as a photographer, I am invested in who we are outside of the lens. I'm invested in, you know, archives. I'm invested in, you know, people. I'm invested in people in my city. And so a lot of times I return, and it's not to just get the image again or to take another image, but it's just to, you know, community build and, you know, share knowledge and share good times. Again, I'm serious about being a part of my neighborhood. I'm serious about being a part of Baltimore. And this was in Shake and Bake, which is the skating ring in West Baltimore. I recently did a photo essay with The Cut, which is a part of New York Magazine, on the ballroom and Vogue and culture. A lot of folks, you know, reference Paris is Burning and reference Vogue and Ballroom to New York. And its birth is New York, but Vogue and Ballroom is just extremely powerful that it has extended throughout the entire world. And so for 3 months, I photographed this community, the balls, the effects, which mean like the outfits that they wear, the practices, and this was a really important story for me. And this was Lexington Market. So for 5 years, I went to Lexington Market faithfully and documented a culture in Lexington Market, and particularly the culture that comes on Saturdays from 12 to 2, enjoys music, enjoys each other's company. And I did that for 5 years. Because I knew that the market was going to close soon. My goal was to also, you know, I went to school for journalism, and I don't really consider myself a journalist, but I really want to merge journalism and art in my own way. But my goal is to, especially with long-term projects like this, my goal is to always be able to tell a story that the reporters at the Baltimore Sun and the rest of these institutions cannot tell. And so it was a true honor to photograph these women, because Lexington Market has been around for centuries, and I've been going to Lexington Market my entire life, and this project is extremely personal for me and my peers and people in the city, because gentrification is displacing everyone, and gentrification is going to be the reason why people at Lexington Market are being displaced, from the vendors to the occupants to the people who hang outside. And so this project was really, really personal for me. The name of the series is The Golden Time of the Day. And it's because it was just such a good time. This is one of my favorite projects that I've worked on. I think this is probably one of my most meaningful projects. But again, showing up every day, showing up every Tuesday and every Saturday, that's just a part of my rituals. And also that's how you build trust. Because for me in Baltimore, people, it's not like New York. People are not camera ready. People are not used to cameras. People are not ready to show their good sides. There has to be a lot of work that's done in between in the process before you get to the actual image making. And that's a part of the process that I take very seriously. These are also 2 images from Lexington Market. He served in, I think, like the Vietnam War, and he met her there, and they got married, and she came back and lived with him. I know these people's personal lives, even if I don't know their names, but I know their stories. I understand their language. I worked on this for 5 years, and it just meant so much. It means so much to me to be able to have a body of work that is about Lexington Market and about the people of Lexington Market, because Lexington Market has a bad rep. And don't get me wrong, there are changes that could happen around the entire city, including a place like Lexington Market. But to basically see half of it torn down, that really makes me feel away. But this project allows me to have a sense of joy and also to preserve that history. So as an artist, photography is like the root of everything that I do. So since we have over 15,000 vacant buildings, homes, and lots, I took it upon myself to wheat paste some images of mine in the city on some of these vacant homes as a way to make the work accessible. I know a lot of people don't have Instagram, they don't have internet in their homes. And so a way for me to be able to show the neighborhood and the community in the city what I do, I just wheat pasted my photographs in the city, just a way to make my work just a little bit more accessible and to also start to think more about public art. And here I went to an artist residency called Elsewhere Museum. If you're ever in Greensboro, North Carolina, please go to Elsewhere. It's an old 4-story vintage store that was turned into a museum. And so I went there and created a permanent installation. I'm gonna show you some photographs from that. So these are just some photographs from the wheat paste that I did. This is like on Utah, right across the street from Lexington Market. And this is, I think, is like down the hill, which I think the new term for it is called Middle East. And these are just some shots from the residency and the installation that I did. My goal at the time, I was in a place of mourning. I think that mourning and grief is a lifelong best friend. And I feel like we all experience it. I certainly have in my lifetime. And my goal is to embrace it and to use it and to channel what I'm feeling into some sort of artwork. And so here is just, I created a large visual that looks like the visuals in Baltimore. And I displayed photographs of people in the city that we might have lost. Like this guy here, I met him at Lexington Market and he passed on. So I do a lot of collage and photo montages using my own images just as a way to be creative, a way to rearrange and arrange and intersect histories and small details of people. It allows me to be a little bit more creative than photography because with photographs, especially street photography, I have to think very quickly, very creatively, very quickly. And so collage allows me to slow down, be a little bit more intentional and a little bit more creative. This is one of my favorites. I went to Tryon, North Carolina, where Nina Simone is from. And this is her childhood home, actually. I went to go consult on why her childhood home should be turned into an artist residency. And I took some photographs there and I just felt the spirit of Nina Simone and I felt the spirit of this home that I decided to make a piece. And this is Westbound. Westbound is actually on exhibit at the old Afro building, which is 2519 North Charles Street, in collaboration with Savannah Wood and Akia Brown. For the Grit Fund, we got a grant and I got a commission to make some work, some collage work using the Afro archives. And so as someone who, you know, spends time with archives, studying it, researching, I also try to bring a different type of functionality to archives, because most time archives sit in the church or sit at home or it sits in an institution. It's visited by some people, but it's just never accessible. And so for me as an artist who archives her own work, who studied archives of other people's work, this was a way for me to include the Afro's archives into my work and just bring a different direction into a creative direction into how we can use archives and make archives accessible. So a lot of this, like here, these figures here, these are the Afros. This is the Afros detail here, but this is my detail right here. And Afro Daddy, again, is another piece of commissioned piece from the collection of work that I did in collaboration with Savannah and the Afro here. And so again, I'm thinking about archives all the time, from it's archiving my own work, but I'm more so thinking about making the archives accessible and being creative about that. And so here again was another way for me to merge my work with the Afro archives. I'm going to finish up soon. Sisters with Stories, a visual storytelling archive that engages and explores Black womanhood, girlhood, and sisterhood. Like Elena said, like Black people, especially Black women, are just not included into the archival process. We're not included into the thought. Where a lot of times our contributions to the world, our identities, who we are, is just an afterthought to some people, especially those who are, you know, documenting the history and the society that we live in. And so as a, you know, photographer, I realized that I have a lot of photographs of men, let me hold myself accountable and make more photographs of Black women. And so this project is centering only Black women, and that's all Black women, including Black trans women. Black trans women and Black trans women matter. And this project here is similar to something that Elena did, actually. So when I was in North Carolina for artist residency, Beatty's Ford Library is a library that's in Beatty's Ford. It's a very important library. It's a library that's embedded in the neighborhood. A lot of youth go there. A lot of people go there. It's like a hub for that town. So every Monday I would go and set up a backdrop and set up my lights and take photographs. And it was amazing because that was very identical of what I do here in Baltimore, but it was a way for me to make the work accessible. It was a way for me to give people copies of the images of themselves to help build on their archive, but also demonstrate the value of archiving. It was a way to, be of service. And so, single mothers and families would drive through a half an hour of traffic just to come to the library, just to have their photograph taken. And that's something that I don't take lightly at all. And so again, community is the basis and the root of my work. I do a lot of archiving work. Oh, my light is going out. I do a lot of archiving work, so a lot of my work is dedicated to demonstrating and promoting the value of archiving. And that means coming up with methods that allows it to be accessible, coming up with methods that meet people where they are, coming up with methods that make sense to everybody. Everyone has a different everyone has different skills. We all have different ways that we learn. And so my archiving methods, for the most part, are not about the historical methods of archiving. It's really about now and what people's needs are. So in the previous photographs, I pointed out the two women had the photographs. One of the things that I do to build trust, but also to demonstrate archiving, is I give people copies of the images that I take of them. So that requires me to have to return. In return, I have to carry. Sometimes if I don't see you again, I might see you in like 4 months and I might have that photograph on me because the city's so small. I roam the streets all day, so I might run into you. And so this is a real way for me to give back. This is a real way for me to, demonstrate to people like, you should be documented. Your life matters, your identity matters. And also it's more room for collaboration. And again, archiving is important. Here is a photograph of Teresa who's in Detroit. This is actually an old image of the Detroit Wall. There's not a lot of information of the Detroit Wall available online. It's not a part of history that was documented that much. And so I met Teresa in 8 Mile and she doesn't respond to email. So I just happened to see her and she pulled out this magazine, which was really helpful because it gave a context because I can't find this image online. And so she really, to me, demonstrated why personal archives are important, why it's important for us to save these newspaper clippings. It's important for us to save these pieces of history that's happening in our neighborhood because one day someone might need it. And this is just a photograph that I made. This is the Detroit Wall here. A lot of the work that I did with this was pretty staged. So I had to do a lot of research and I had to, conceptualize how was I going to depict this history in relation to the community where it stands now. And these photographs will be available on display at the Mint Museum in Charlotte in February 2021. It was supposed to happen this year, but it was pushed back. And then this is just a photo of 410 in the BMA. My beginning with photography, I'm graduating to more collage work. I have some collage work behind me, but also this is just a small depiction of the collage work. And then here, again, it's just images of Lexington Market. So the plan was to have these images change and shift out every couple of months, but since we had COVID, we had to make some temporary changes. But these are just images. So my goal with the Lexington Market project is it's an archival body of work, and so my plan is to sit on it for about 10 years and not really show much of it. So if you see it in the BMA, that's great, maybe in some presentations, but the body of work itself will not be shown until maybe 10, 20 years from now. And I'm thinking more about making work for a later date. And yeah, this is my email and my website. Thank you all. That's the end of my presentation, but thank you all for having me. I really appreciate you listening.
Wonderful. Shan, thank you so much. Really interesting narrative that you shared with us. One question I have for you, which I don't want you to answer necessarily, but the BMA decided to have a space at the Lexington Market. Was that something that you initiated or no? Okay.
Yeah, the two people who run it is Malika and Dave. Mm-hmm. They are phenomenal at what they're doing at Lexington Market, the BMA. Right now it's closed off, so they're doing art. They're giving away art materials, I think on from Saturday to Thursday. So that wasn't me, but the programming that I had scheduled was happening at the BMA satellite location in Lexington Market. And that was portrait photographs. We got through one session, but it was portraits and teaching a couple of classes and doing a couple of lectures. But Dave and Malika are doing phenomenal, and as a Baltimorean too, doing phenomenal work at Lexington Market.
I also want to comment, I love hearing the bus sounds, moving, in the space that you're in. So that's interesting. Elena, I'm
North Avenue and Howard Street. It's crazy busy.
It's wonderful. Thank you. And that's at the Motor House then, right? You're at the Motor House. Cool, good. Yeah. Elena, I'm wondering if you would like to comment here on what you, in resonance or in reflection of what Shan was talking about.
Thank you, Shan, for a wonderful presentation of your work. And just to see you, I met Shan when our mutual friend recommended that we interview you for the 10 frames per second podcast. And it's just incredible how much your work has grown and how much you have accomplished. And I just love seeing everything that you've done. And I'm actually going to redirect Lori's question into one of the questions that came up in the Q&A. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, so you did cover, this question about how your experiences as a human being informed your photography, but maybe you can just kind of formalize. We have a lot of students here tuning in, so tell us what would be your advice for those who want to find their own voice in photography. Sometimes honestly, speaking personally, sometimes it's very difficult for me to decide what I want to do because, it's not, I may not have the right personality to do this or that kind of work, or maybe those are the boundaries I'm putting myself in. But if you could just talk about what would be your advice for people to find their voice?
I would say a lot of studying for sure, and seeing the bodies of works and the genre of photography that you want to contribute to. For me, I like James Van Der Zee. I like Lewis Martin. There are a lot of photographers, documentary photographers, especially Lewis Martin, who is a name we've probably never heard of. But we kind of do the similar type of photography, and it's basically community photography. You photograph cookouts and you photograph the things that are happening in your neighborhood. And that resonated with me because that's in line with what I want to do and what I feel called to do. So I think that being able to identify just the type of photography that I want to engage in and I want other people to engage in, I think some real advice is listening to yourself. What do you why are you doing this? Why are you picking up a camera? If you're picking up a camera for yourself as a hobby, that's great. If you're picking up a camera because you want to see images in the world that you haven't seen yet, that's great too. If you're picking up a camera to make some money and be a freelance portrait photographer, that's great as well. I think really trying to understand why you're doing this in the first place is always the biggest, like the biggest piece of advice that I wish that I would have gotten, and I can give other people, because you know there are so many types of photography and not everybody can do every type of photography. So you know, staying in your lane and really figuring out where you fit in this world, I feel like is grand and helpful. And not saying that you won't graduate to a different type of photography or a different type of imagery or a different type of photo making, but you know, starting from a place that feels genuine, starting from a place that is not operating from ego, starting from a place that, you know, aligns with what you want to do and the change that you want to be in the world, I think that's like key. Because not everybody wants to make, not everybody centers community and accessibility in their work, and that's fine. That's totally cool. But you have to be able to define what type of work and what type of voice you're going to have for yourself. And only you can define that through experience, through mentorship, through school, maybe. But that takes time. It takes time. Like I've accomplished a shit ton and I'm happy for it, but it took time. It took time, and it took wasting money. It took being inexperienced. It took, you know, going down some of the wrong roads, but it all takes time. But if you're asking those questions and you're on that journey of curiosity, you'll be rewarded with answers if you're doing what you need to be doing.
Beautiful, Shan. That's so well tied up in a nice bow. I mean, you know, really thoughtful, and thank you so much. A question that's come up, you know, people are wondering, have you, both of you, always been interested in photography? You know, I think we could, for you, Shan, we could knit together. You studied journalism, but then somehow you picked up the camera. Elena, you call yourself a multidisciplinary artist. So could you two comment on that?
Okay, I can speak up. I started studying ceramics when I was in college, and then I took my first photography class, and that was it for me. And then I fell out of love with photography, so I started doing drawing. So I created drawings and installation work for a while. I feel like what draws me to photography is slightly different than Shan. I like just like the craft of it, and I really like thinking how I can push the boundaries of what it means to create an image. And I think that that's the thing that keeps me engaged and interested. And also I love working with alternative processes in film, and sometimes I just love making things that are pretty and look good, but I also very conscious about that, and I'm like putting my own boundaries around my work, and kind of like in a way either not showing it to anybody or like not doing it because I'm worried too much about craft. So all those things are running through my head, and I'm kind of like an artist that I approach a project. So today I'm doing this thing, and tomorrow I'm going to start doing completely different. So as I could relate to what Shan was saying about, you know, finding a voice that doesn't have to be just one voice. You can do many different things and love them for different reasons. Yeah.
I took my first photograph when I was like 8. My grandparents had a Polaroid camera, so I would take photographs of them. And then we got a video camera, and I used to record me and my cat playing fetch. And so I was always interested in just the camera as a tool. I don't even think that I wasn't even thinking this far ahead. I mean, if you would have told me 10 years ago I would be an artist pursuing art and making art, I probably would have believed you, but I would have questioned like how I got there. Because I always played basketball. I played professional ball, so that was like where I was going. That was like my planned out future. But it was just something about, you know, sports that I didn't, the politics of it just wasn't appealing anymore. And journalism was cool. I went to Emerson, and so we had a mass communications department in high school. So I engaged with like writing, broadcasts, and photography was at least one, but I think it really kicked off because I was working at Best Buy and I was working at the camera department. And I would get in trouble so often, and I would have low sales because I would be in the back just playing with cameras, trying to sell cameras, not really trying to sell the accessories, but just trying to sell the cameras and trying to get to know the cameras. So I think that my love for just imagery and visual depictions and visual art kind of like manifested into like photography. And I think now I'm at a point where it's manifesting into something else.
Wow. Well, here's another, thank you, Shannon and Elena, that's very thoughtful and helpful to kind of frame these things. We have another question, and this might be our last question for the evening. What do you hope to happen during a photo session?
I'm gonna let Shan go first.
And I in a photo session, so that could go a couple of ways. When it's a portrait, I hope that the negotiation between the sitter and myself is clear. I, you know, want people to be informed of what I do. I want them to be informed of the value and the power of a person sitting and having their photograph taken. And I hope that all of that makes that sitter a little bit more comfortable. I hope that it makes them a little bit more aware and understanding and compassionate to the power of having your photograph taken, especially portraits. I do portraits, but I want to do them more. It's one of my favorite genres of photography just because it's so intentional, and there's a connection that has to be built on in that process. When it comes to like street photography, everything is happening very quickly for me, especially being in Baltimore. Like I said before, it's not New York where everyone is like camera ready. There's a lot of activity happening. There are a lot of people who don't trust cameras. I tried to take a photo of a woman today and she was like, no, I don't know what you're going to do with it. And so there can be a moment where I can like explain to her. And then there are moments when I don't feel like explaining that. And so I think ideally, you know, being as safe as possible, but also being able, when there's the moment that presents itself, being able to creatively and critically think real quick so I can get the image that I want to get that can lead me to the next image. Because that's how it usually works in street photography for me. The first image leads me to the next one, it leads me to the next one, it leads me to the next one. And then I come home and I dissect through what I have, and then I put this one here with this body work, and I put this one here with this body of work. And so I'm always hoping that, you know, people are open, but also that these moments present itself and that these moments continue to present themselves.
Elena, you're gonna comment here?
I'm gonna pitch in, and I don't know if I could top that because I actually, Shan said it so beautifully. I agree with all of this. I have, you know, because my personality is different, I would never do the work that Shan does. But I feel like I agree with the special moment that needs to happen. And I'm just hoping for all of you who are tuning in, just like this like moment of trust needs to really happen in order for this photograph to be great. We can take a bunch of mediocre pictures, but you as a subject being photographed, as a participant in this experience, your responsibility is to trust me and not be awkward, right? I don't know how that happened. That sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. And it just, I feel like people need to understand that you know, it's very difficult for us photographers to participate, and it could be just as painful of an experience to take a photo as to be photographed. If we could just relax and trust each other in that moment. So it's kind of like the moment of trust and the moment of falling in love, plus technology needs to work. that's
transparency. You know, like that transparency has to be there, because I want to know what your terms are as a sitter, and you have to know what my terms are as a photographer, because it can get awkward. And, you know, again, the process, if I know we got students here, the process is critical. The end result is okay, like you get your end goal, that's cool, but the process is so critical, and the process is so important. Like, be really present in that, because, you know, like that's where the freedom is, that's where the fluidness is in the process. The end goal is going to happen if the process is what you make it out to be.
Well, that is just a great way to say thank you to both of you. Really excellent. Thank you again. A beautiful conversation here. And audience members, we have recorded this conversation, these presentations, and it will be uploaded to our to the SOTA's website, you know, within a couple weeks. Again, if you'd like to become a part of our email list, just leave your email in the chat, and we'll add you to it. So again, best of luck to both of you, and thank you again for sharing your time with us. Really.
Thank you so much.
Have a good night.
Thank you, Shane.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.